I didn't yell when I found out. I didn't raise my voice, slam a door, or throw anything across the room. There was no dramatic scene, no shaking hands, no sudden rush of anger that people expect when something breaks this badly. I remember sitting there, breathing slowly, feeling oddly steady, like my body had decided to shut off the noise before my mind could catch up. What surprised me most wasn't what she did. It was my own reaction. I had always imagined betrayal as something loud, something sharp that split you open in an instant. Instead, it arrived quietly, like a weight settling on my chest. Heavy, yes, but strangely calm. I noticed small details around me that day. The hum of the fan, the way light rested on the wall, the fact that my hands weren't shaking at all. People think silence means weakness. They assume that if you're not shouting, you must be in denial or afraid or plotting something dramatic. But my silence came from clarity, not confusion. In that moment, I knew that yelling wouldn't change the truth. Breaking things wouldn't undo what had already happened. All it would do is turn my pain into noise, and I didn't want that. I remember standing up and walking to the window, looking outside like the world hadn't just shifted under my feet. Cars passed. Someone laughed somewhere nearby. Life kept moving with an indifference that felt almost insulting. Yet I stood there, calm, listening to my own breathing, realizing that the absence of rage felt more powerful than any outburst I could have staged. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't ask questions or demand explanations. I let the knowledge sit with me, raw and unpolished. There was a strange sense of control in that pause, like holding a fragile object without squeezing too hard. I knew that once words were spoken, they couldn't be pulled back. What no one tells you is that calm can be terrifying. Not just for the person watching you, but for yourself. When the anger doesn't come, you're left alone with the truth, stripped of distractions. And in that quiet, you start to see things clearly. That was where I was, standing in the aftermath, composed, silent, already changed, even though the story hadn't been told yet. There was a quiet decision forming beneath that stillness, though I didn't name it yet. I simply stayed present, letting the moment exist without forcing it to make sense. I knew reactions could wait. Truth had already arrived, and it wasn't in a hurry. That calm was not mercy, and it wasn't surrender. It was me standing still, watching carefully, understanding that the loudest moments often come later, when silence has done its work. I didn't realize then how much that quiet beginning would shape everything that followed, but it was the first step away from chaos and toward something steady, deliberate, and impossible to undo. Once I finally spoke later, before everything shifted, life felt ordinary in the most comforting way. We moved through our days on quiet routines that didn't need much thought. Mornings meant shared coffee, small talk about work, and deciding who would pick up groceries later. Nights were predictable too. Dinner, a show playing softly in the background, phones resting face down on the table because there was nothing to hide and no reason to check. Money was a shared conversation, never a fight. We split expenses, planned ahead, talked about saving and the little rewards we allowed ourselves once in a while. Upgrades were discussed casually, almost playfully. A new pair of shoes, a weekend away someday. And yes, phones. She liked keeping up with the latest models, scrolling through videos, pointing out features she found impressive. I listened, nodded, joked about how fast technology moved. It all felt harmless. There were moments when she talked about wanting more, but it never sounded dangerous. Came out as daydreams, not demands. A better camera, More storage. A sleeker design. I didn't see it as obsession, just interest, the same way people talk about cars or clothes they like but don't urgently need. I trusted that if something mattered, she would say it plainly. Trust was the quiet foundation of everything. We didn't check each other's messages. We didn't question late replies. If plans changed, explanations were simple and accepted. That kind of ease builds slowly, and once it's there, you stop noticing it. You assume it's permanent, like gravity, like something that can't suddenly disappear. Looking back, the signs people talk about weren't there yet. No secrecy, no tension in her voice, no sudden distance. She laughed the same way. She complained about work the same way. If anything, she seemed relaxed, comfortable in the life we had built together. The days blended into each other, and that sameness felt like security. Even the conversations about wanting nicer things stayed light, almost teasing. I remember her holding her phone once, saying it was starting to feel outdated, then smiling and saying it was fine for now. I believed her because there was no reason not to. Normalcy has a way of softening your awareness. When everything feels stable, you don't scan for cracks. You don't imagine hidden costs behind casual words. You accept what's in front of you as complete. That's what those days were like. Simple, shared, and unremarkable in a way that felt safe. If you had asked me then, I would have said we were doing well. Not perfect, but steady. And steady felt like enough. It was a life built on routine and trust, with nothing loud enough to demand attention. Nothing that warned me how easily normal can be mistaken for permanent, and how quietly desire can sit in a room before it decides to speak louder. Those were the days I believed comfort meant safety, unaware how easily comfort is borrowed by silence, patience, and assumptions never questioning themselves. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They slipped in quietly, so small they felt easy to ignore. First, it was the phone. She used to leave it anywhere, screen dark, forgotten on the couch or kitchen counter. Then it started staying closer to her, always face down, always within reach. If a notification buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, thumb hovering, then say it was nothing. She talked about the iPhone 16 more often too. Not in a demanding way, just casually bringing it up in conversation. A feature she'd seen online. A camera comparison. How smooth everything looked in the ads. Sometimes she laughed about it, saying she was joking, that it wasn't a big deal. The way she said it made me feel silly for even noticing. Once, half smiling, she said she'd do anything to get one. Sounded like a joke, and I treated it like one. We laughed, and the moment passed. Still, something about the way she said it lingered with me longer than it should have. Not because it was alarming, but because it felt oddly specific. There were other small shifts too. She angled her screen away when scrolling. Took calls in another room more often. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that clearly crossed a line. If I asked who she was talking to, she answered easily, without hesitation. Her explanations made sense, and I accepted them because trust doesn't disappear overnight. I noticed myself becoming more aware, not suspicious, just attentive. When she mentioned the phone again, I listened more closely. When she laughed it off, I wondered why it needed to be laughed off at all. These thoughts came and went, never staying long enough to form accusations. What made it confusing was how normal everything else remained. She still showed affection, still talked about plans, still complained about small things that had nothing to do with phones or money. If there was something wrong, it hid itself well, tucked between ordinary moments. Looking back now, those were the cracks. Thin, almost invisible lines you only see after something breaks. At the time, they felt like coincidences, like harmless habits changing with time. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask deeper questions. I told myself that wanting something new didn't mean anything beyond that. It's strange how hindsight sharpens everything. The jokes sound different. The casual comments feel heavier. The secrecy becomes obvious once you know where it leads. But in that moment, I was still standing inside normal life, adjusting slightly, unaware that these tiny shifts were quietly rewriting the ground beneath me. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing demanded action. That's what made it easy to stay comfortable, to trust the familiar rhythm we had built. The cracks were there, but they were polite. They waited. I found out without looking for it. That's the part people never expect. There was no late-night investigation, no scrolling through messages with a racing heart. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, tucked inside a moment that should have meant nothing at all. Her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. It sat on the table between us, screen lighting up the room for just a second. I wasn't trying to read it. I wasn't even curious. But the preview lingered long enough for my eyes to catch it before I could look away. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't unlock anything. I just stared at the screen until it went dark again. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. Friends text. Coworkers send pictures. Life keeps moving. But something in my chest tightened, slow and deliberate, like a door closing. Later that evening, she mentioned the phone. Not the message, the phone itself. She laughed and said she finally had it handled, that someone owed her a favor. She said it casually, like it was a joke I wasn't fully in on. I nodded, unsure what she meant, and she didn't explain. The truth came together quietly after that. Not in one dramatic reveal, but through small, undeniable pieces. Payment confirmation I wasn't meant to see. A slip in conversation where dates didn't line up. A name repeated once too often. Each detail landed gently, but together they formed something solid and unmistakable. There was no moment where my knees buckled or my vision blurred. I didn't feel dizzy. I felt clear. The picture that formed was simple and impossible to soften. She hadn't cheated out of love or loneliness or confusion. She had traded herself for something she wanted. A device. A thing that would be outdated in a year. I sat with that knowledge in silence. No music. No pacing. Just the weight of understanding settling in. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't feel like a scene from a movie. It felt like reading a receipt you never asked for but couldn't deny. What hurt wasn't just the act itself. It was how ordinary the discovery was. How easily the truth slipped into my hands without resistance. There was no dramatic villain, no complicated mystery. Just a clean exchange and a quiet realization that trust can be broken without noise. I remember thinking how strange it was that nothing around me had changed. The room looked the same. The air felt the same. But something irreversible had already happened. I didn't confront her then. I didn't react. I simply acknowledged the truth as it was, plain and unadorned, knowing that once you see something clearly, you can never pretend you didn't. That understanding settled quietly, and I knew the next step would matter, because once truth arrives this way, calm becomes a choice, not a delay, and every word you save gains weight you cannot remove later, no matter how much time passes. The anger never arrived. I waited for it, almost expecting it to burst through me like it was supposed to. But it didn't. What came instead was a stillness that felt unfamiliar. My chest felt tight. not with rage, but with something heavier and quieter. It was as if my body had flipped a switch and shut everything loud down. I noticed it physically before I understood it emotionally. My breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. My thoughts stopped racing and lined up neatly, one behind the other. There was no shaking, no urge to move, no impulse to say anything at all. Just a strange clarity settling in, calm and uninvited. I remember thinking how odd it was to feel so steady while everything underneath me had shifted. Betrayal is supposed to feel like fire. Mine felt like ice. Not cold in a painful way, but controlled, preserving everything exactly as it was so I could see it clearly. I wasn't numb. I was aware, sharply aware. I didn't replay the details over and over. I didn't imagine confrontations or speeches. I didn't ask myself how long it had been happening or why. Those questions felt pointless in that moment. The facts were enough. Adding emotion wouldn't change them, and I wasn't interested in comforting myself with noise. Time passed differently then. Minutes stretched out, quiet and slow. I went about simple tasks without thinking too hard about them. Washing my hands. Sitting down. Looking at the same wall longer than usual. Everything felt deliberate, like I was moving through water instead of air. I knew I could confront her right away if I wanted to. I knew the words were there, ready, but something told me not to rush. Not because I was afraid of what she'd say, but because I didn't want to give the moment more power than it deserved. Reacting immediately felt like handing control over to something that had already taken enough. Silence became a choice. Each second I didn't speak felt intentional. Powerful, even. I realized that the first reaction is rarely the most honest one. It's the loudest, the messiest, the one that burns itself out and leaves nothing useful behind. I didn't want that. There was a strange confidence in waiting, not plotting, not punishing, just letting the truth exist without interference. I trusted myself to act later, when my voice would be steady and my mind clear. I trusted that I didn't need to rush to prove how hurt I was. That pause changed everything. It shifted the balance in ways I couldn't yet see. While the betrayal sat there, exposed and undeniable, I stayed quiet, grounded, and present. I wasn't freezing to avoid the pain. I was cooling it down, giving it shape, preparing to decide what came next without letting emotion make the choice for me. I didn't rush toward her with the truth. I carried it with me quietly, letting it settle until it felt solid in my hands. Somewhere in that stillness, I began to think about what came next. Not the outcome, not the reaction, but the manner. How I would speak. How I would hold myself. What kind of moment I wanted it to be. I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want insults slipping out of anger. I didn't want accusations thrown like weapons. I didn't want to raise my voice just to prove that I was hurt. None of that felt useful. None of it felt like me. I wanted facts, nothing more. Facts don't shout. They don't beg. They just exist. I imagined how the conversation might unfold. I pictured her face when I asked the first question, the casual answers she would give without realizing where it was going. I expected denial. Not dramatic denial, but the soft kind. The kind wrapped in laughter or confusion. I prepared for that without rehearsing speeches. I only needed to know what I would ask and when to stop talking. I practiced restraint more than words. I reminded myself that silence could be more effective than interruption. That letting her fill the space would reveal more than pushing her into a corner. I told myself to stay slow, to breathe, to keep my voice even no matter what she said. Control wasn't about dominance. It was about not losing myself. Emotionally, I prepared for discomfort. Not anger, but sadness, embarrassment, maybe even pity. I accepted that I might feel all of it at once. The key was not letting those feelings steer the conversation. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted clarity, clear answers, clear behavior, clear boundaries. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if staying calm would make me seem weak, if not reacting strongly enough would somehow minimize what she'd done. But those thoughts passed quickly. I knew that calm didn't erase the seriousness of the truth. It sharpened it. I chose a setting carefully. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere ordinary. I didn't want drama built into the environment. I wanted the words to carry the weight, not the surroundings. Everything about it was intentional, even the timing. Not rushed. Not delayed out of fear. Just ready. As the moment approached, I felt steady. Not excited. Not anxious. Prepared. I trusted that composure wasn't fragile, as long as I didn't feed it unnecessary emotion. Whatever she said, whatever she denied or admitted, I knew one thing clearly. I wasn't walking into that conversation to react. I was walking in to observe, to listen, and to let the truth speak for itself while I remained exactly where I was, grounded and unmoved. When the moment finally came, it didn't announce itself. There was no sharp turn, no dramatic pause. We were sitting across from each other, the space between us filled with ordinary silence. I started with something small, almost meaningless, the kind of question you could ask on any day without raising suspicion. She answered easily. Her voice was relaxed, familiar. She didn't sense anything unusual, and that was intentional. I nodded, listened, let her words settle before asking the next question. Each one was simple, neutral, stripped of emotion. Dates, details, casual observations framed as curiosity, not accusation. She smiled at first, shrugged at one question, joked at another. The conversation flowed the way it always had, light and unguarded. That was the strange part. Knowing what I knew, hearing her speak so comfortably felt unreal, like watching a familiar scene with new information that changed everything underneath it. I kept my tone even. I didn't lean forward or pull away. I let pauses exist without filling them. Silence has a way of inviting people to keep talking, and she did. She explained things that didn't need explaining, offered details I hadn't asked for. Each sentence added shape to the picture I already understood. There was tension, but it stayed low and contained, like pressure building slowly beneath the surface. No raised voices, no sharp words. Just a quiet imbalance forming as she sensed the conversation wasn't as harmless as it seemed. Her answers began to slow. She searched my face more often, looking for something to anchor herself. I asked another question, still calm, still polite. That's when her smile hesitated. Just for a moment, long enough to notice. She laughed it off, but the sound landed differently this time. Thinner, uncertain. I didn't react. I didn't correct her. I simply waited. The discomfort crept in gently. It wasn't fear yet. It was confusion. The kind that comes when the ground feels familiar but no longer solid. She shifted in her seat, touched her phone, then moved her hand away. Her words became careful, measured. I realized then how powerful restraint can be. If I had confronted her outright, the conversation would have turned loud and defensive instantly. But this quiet approach gave her space to reveal herself without being pushed. Every neutral question acted like a mirror, reflecting back inconsistencies she hadn't prepared to face. I stayed where I was emotionally steady, present, observing. The conversation hadn't exploded, but it was no longer safe. The tension lived in what wasn't being said, in the widening gap between her confidence and her answers. And as I listened, I knew this was only the beginning. The calm hadn't broken yet, but it was bending, slowly, under the weight of truth she hadn't realized she was already carrying. There was a moment when the conversation crossed an invisible line. Not because my tone changed, but because I stopped asking and started stating. I placed the proof between us without ceremony. No dramatic gesture. No emphasis. Just facts, laid out gently, like items on a table. I watched her face as the understanding reached her. First, there was confusion. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly, her eyes moving from what I'd said back to me, as if she expected clarification. She smiled again, reflexively, trying to treat it like a misunderstanding. She asked a question, light and uncertain, hoping I would correct myself. I didn't. The silence stretched, and confusion turned into something sharper. Panic crept in quietly, changing the way she breathed, the way she sat. Her shoulders stiffened. Her gaze flicked away, then back again. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried a different approach. A quick explanation, a deflection, a story that didn't quite land. I stayed calm. I didn't interrupt her. I let her words trail off on their own. When I spoke again, my voice was steady, almost gentle. I clarified one detail, then another. Each sentence removed another place for her to hide. I wasn't attacking her character. I wasn't listing grievances. I was simply confirming what was already true. That's when she realized what was happening. Not that she was being accused, but that she had already been seen. Fully. Clearly. There was no argument left to win because I wasn't arguing. There was no emotional reaction to counter because I wasn't giving one. Defensiveness arrived next, wrapped in justifications. She talked faster now. Her hands moved as she spoke. She explained motivations, circumstances, pressures. She tried to reframe the situation to make it smaller, more understandable. I listened without responding, without correcting her version of events. What unsettled her most wasn't the proof itself. It was my lack of reaction. She kept searching my face for anger, for hurt, for something she could respond to. But I gave her none of it. The calm didn't soften the truth. It sharpened it. I could see it in her eyes when it finally settled. The realization that she wasn't under attack, but she was exposed. That there was nothing left to negotiate emotionally. No shouting match to blur the facts. No chaos to hide inside. The power shifted quietly then. Not because I demanded it, but because I didn't need to. She stopped talking mid-sentence, the weight of her own words hanging in the air. For the first time since the conversation began, she looked unsure of what to say next. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Watching the collapse wasn't satisfying. It was clarifying. The truth stood between us, undeniable and complete, and I understood that this moment wasn't about winning or punishing. It was about seeing clearly who I was sitting across from, without noise, without distortion, and without the need to raise my voice even once. I didn't realize anyone else was paying attention. We were in a place where people come and go, voices blending into the background, nothing about us standing out. The conversation stayed quiet, contained between us, and I assumed it would remain that way. I didn't notice the phone nearby, propped casually, its camera angled just enough to catch what it needed. The shift happened later after the moment had already passed. A friend messaged me, asking if everything was okay, saying they'd seen something online. I didn't understand what they meant at first. Then another message came and another, all with the same quiet concern. Someone had recorded a portion of the conversation without intending to make it public. No faces framed dramatically, no shouting, no obvious conflict. Just two people sitting across from each other, one calm, one unraveling. The clip was short, unpolished, and steady. That steadiness was what caught attention. People weren't used to seeing confrontation without volume. They weren't used to watching someone speak carefully while the other side collapsed on its own. The comments filled in the gaps the video left open. Within hours, it had spread beyond the people involved. Strangers slowed it down, analyzed pauses, replayed expressions. They projected their own experiences into the silence. Some praised the restraint, others criticized the exposure. I didn't share it, comment on it, or explain myself. The situation had moved beyond my control the moment it left that room. What surprised me was how people reacted to the calm more than the betrayal. The absence of shouting became the headline. In a world trained to expect chaos, stillness stood out. That was the part that traveled, copied, shared, and discussed. Not the phone, not the argument, but the way the truth was delivered. The private moment had become public without my permission. It felt strange, watching strangers react to something that had felt so contained. Yet I understood why it resonated. People weren't watching for drama. They were watching for control, for proof that calm could survive pressure. I hadn't intended to make a statement. I had only intended to speak truthfully. Somehow that was enough to set everything in motion. The clip kept moving while I stayed still, living my life quietly as the noise grew elsewhere. I realized then that once a moment is seen, it no longer belongs only to you. It becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever people bring to it. All I could do was let it pass without feeding it. The truth had already spoken in a voice calm enough for anyone to hear. What followed online no longer felt like mine to manage or correct. I stepped back, letting the wave move without me. The calm that unsettled her now unsettled thousands, and that realization stayed with me. It proved that sometimes the quietest moments echo the farthest. I watched it fade from my screen, knowing its work was already done. Nothing I said afterward could change what people felt. The internet moved faster than I ever could. By the time I understood how far the clip had gone, it was already everywhere. People I didn't know had opinions about a moment they'd never lived. Some dissected every pause, every glance, as if they were decoding something hidden. Others turned it into jokes, screenshots turned into captions, short clips looping with added music. The noise grew louder by the hour. Friends sent messages asking if I was okay. Acquaintances offered advice I hadn't asked for. Strangers argued about my character, her character, the ethics of recording, the meaning behind my silence. Everyone seemed certain about what I should feel, what I should do next, how I should react now that the world was watching. I didn't respond to any of it. Not out of strategy, not to appear composed, but because I didn't have anything to say yet. My life wasn't a comment section. What had happened between us still needed space to settle, and no amount of online consensus could speed that up. While the internet churned, my days stayed quiet. I woke up, made coffee, sat in familiar rooms that now felt different. The absence was louder than the reactions. The relationship wasn't collapsing publicly for me. It was collapsing privately, in small moments of realization that no one else could see. I thought about the things we'd shared, the plans that would quietly dissolve. I replayed conversations that now carried new meaning. None of that fit into a post or a reply. Healing doesn't perform well online. It happens slowly, without witnesses, without applause. The contrast was surreal. On one screen, chaos. On the other, silence. People arguing loudly about a situation that, for me, had become painfully still. I realized how easily ego could have pulled me into it. How tempting it would be to explain myself, defend my calm, clarify details. But doing that would have shifted my focus outward, when it needed to stay inward. Silence became protection. Not hiding, but choosing where my energy went. Every unanswered notification felt like a small reclaiming of control. I wasn't interested in being right in public if it meant delaying peace in private. As days passed, the reactions began to blur together. The shock dulled. New stories replaced mine. That's how it always works. What mattered was that I hadn't let the noise shape my next steps. I stayed grounded while the world moved on. In the quiet, I began to understand something important. The internet could witness a moment, amplify it, even distort it, but it couldn't live with the consequences. That part was mine alone. So I let the comments scroll past, unanswered, while I sat with the truth of what was ending and what might begin. In choosing silence, I wasn't disappearing. I was giving myself room to heal without an audience, trusting that the loudest reactions fade, but the choices you make in stillness last. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once for her. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, the way real consequences tend to. First, there was embarrassment. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that settles into posture and tone. She became more careful with her words, more aware of who was listening. The confidence she once carried easily now seemed heavier, harder to lift. She tried to explain herself to people, though the explanations shifted depending on who was asking. Sometimes it was pressure. Sometimes it was a misunderstanding. Sometimes it was framed as something mutual, something complicated that couldn't be reduced to a clip online. None of the versions fully matched, and that inconsistency followed her. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue with the stories she told. I watched from a distance as she attempted to regain control of a narrative that no longer belonged to either of us. That loss seemed to unsettle her more than the exposure itself. When you can't define how you're seen, you start grasping for versions that feel survivable. There were moments when she reached out, not always directly to apologize, but to test the ground. Casual messages, neutral questions, small gestures that hinted at wanting to be understood rather than held accountable. I responded when necessary, briefly, without reopening anything that had already closed. Her rationalizations grew softer over time, less defensive, more tired. The justifications lost their edge as reality settled in. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as discomfort that lingers, refusing to resolve itself neatly. I noticed how the attention affected her. At first, it overwhelmed her. Then it faded, as attention always does, leaving her alone with the choices she had made. Without an audience, there was nothing to perform against. Just reflection or avoidance or a mixture of both. People expected me to celebrate that shift, to take satisfaction in watching her struggle. But I didn't feel that. What I felt was distance, emotional separation. Her process was no longer tied to mine. Whatever lessons she faced were hers to learn or not. There was no dramatic downfall. No sudden redemption either. Just a series of adjustments, consequences that reshaped how she moved through the world. Trust lost in quiet conversations. Opportunities that felt different now. The subtle weight of knowing that actions echo longer than intentions. That realism mattered to me. Kept the story grounded. There was no revenge, no moral victory parade. Just accountability playing out in human ways. I didn't need her to suffer to feel resolved. I needed the truth to stand on its own. Watching from where I was, I understood something clearly. Consequences don't need witnesses to be real. They don't need commentary or outrage. They unfold in private moments, in changed behavior, in the slow recognition of what was lost and why. And in letting that process be hers, untouched by my interference, I felt a deeper sense of closure than any confrontation could have given me. When everything finally quieted down, what stayed with me wasn't the betrayal itself, but what it revealed. Not about her, but about me. The situation stripped away assumptions I didn't realize I was carrying. It showed me where my values actually lived, not where I claimed they did in easier times. I learned that self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. It shows up in the moments when reacting would be easier than staying still. I used to think strength meant confronting things head-on, saying everything that came to mind, proving you were hurt enough to be taken seriously. Now I understand that strength can also look like restraint, like choosing not to turn pain into performance. Boundaries became clearer too. Not the kind you explain over and over, but the kind you set once and then live by. I realized that boundaries don't require permission. They don't need to be dramatic. They exist quietly, shaping what you allow close to you and what you step away from without bitterness. I didn't feel like I had won anything. There was no sense of victory in watching something end. Loss doesn't become success just because you handled it calmly. What I felt instead was alignment. My actions matched the kind of person I wanted to be, even when it was uncomfortable. That mattered more than being right, more than being understood by strangers, more than any temporary validation. Peace arrived slowly, not as relief but as steadiness. Mornings became simpler again. My thoughts stopped looping back to explanations I never gave. The noise faded, replaced by an awareness of what I could control and what I no longer needed to carry. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped imagining different outcomes. The story had already taught me what it needed to. Looking back, I see how easily I could have handled it differently. I could have chased reactions, argued publicly, clung to anger as proof that something mattered. Instead, I chose to let the truth stand without decoration. I chose to walk away quietly, without dragging the moment further than it needed to go. That choice changed how I see future conflicts. Not everything needs escalation. Not every hurt needs a response. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is observe, decide, and move forward without demanding closure from someone else. This wasn't a story about humiliation or exposure. It was a reminder that your response defines you more than what happens to you. I didn't raise my voice, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence said enough. Life didn't end. It adjusted. And in that adjustment, I found something steady to stand on. A sense that peace isn't something you're given after chaos. It's something you choose, quietly, when you decide not to let chaos follow you any further. If the story held you here longer than you expected, take a moment before you scroll away. Stories like this aren't told to shock or entertain for a few seconds. They exist to remind us that quiet strength is real, and that how we respond matters more than what we face. If you've lived through something similar, or felt that slow realization settle in your chest, you're not alone. Many people carry moments like these silently, unsure where to place them. Sometimes hearing another voice describe it calmly helps you understand your own experience with a little more clarity. This space is for stories told without shouting, without forcing emotion, without rushing to judgment. If that's the kind of reflection you value, you're welcome to stay. Subscribe if you want more moments like this, shared gently and honestly. And if someone in your life might need to hear this today, consider sharing it with them. Not to make a point, but to offer quiet understanding. You never know who's standing at the edge of a decision, needing reassurance that calm is allowed. Thank you for listening all the way through. Your time matters. Take care, choose peace, and protect quiet.